Matt Cunningham, thank you. Let's go to our political panel now. Liberal Senator James Paterson and Labor MP Josh Burns, and start on this very topic. You've had a bit to say about this along the way, James Paterson. Where do you sit on the detail we're hearing today?
I think it's a very sensible proposal that's been put forward by the Minister and two very eminent Indigenous leaders that have been asked to help in the process going forward. So I really welcome that. The government's policy is clear on the question of whether it'll be ever enshrined in the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that we're not willing to explore all avenues to better hear Indigenous voices in the policy-making process, and crucially to make sure that they're heard both at the local and the state level as well as the national level. One of the things that Ken Wyatt has talked about is that often the concerns that are raised with him, particularly in remote and regional Australia, are often to do with municipal services or state government services, health, education, policing, that a national voice to Parliament, as envisaged by Uluru, wouldn't have been able to effectively deal with.
This is being in danger, though, by some people there of being seen as just too little. It's now something that's going to be a voice to government, not to all of Parliament, not enshrined in the Constitution. How is this different to another advisory board if it's just a voice to government?
Well, let's see what comes out of the committee process. I'm very open-minded about exactly what could work. But one of the models that's been identified by Julian Leeser and Pat Dodson in their previous inquiry to Parliament is of effective local and regional voices that represent the concerns of Indigenous Australians in a defined area very effectively to local and state government bodies and make sure that their concerns are heard and met and addressed. If that could be rolled out effectively, because that's patchwork, it doesn't exist across the country, but if that could be rolled out effectively across the country, then I think that'd be a really welcome change, because local people should have control over local decisions and strong input into local decisions because they're the ones that are affected by them most. So I think that makes complete sense to me.
Josh Burns, where do you sit on this?
Look, I think that Ken making progress obviously is an important step, but we all remember days after the election where Ken Wyatt was appointed as the first Aboriginal person to hold the office of Indigenous Affairs, and the government and Scott Morrison needs to be applauded for that. But after he gave his speech in the press conference, in the press club, where he announced he wanted to move towards constitutional recognition in line with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it took less than a day for Scott Morrison to put a whole lot of caveats and to cut Ken down. So I think Ken needs some space. I think he needs support from the government. I think we need to be constantly aligned and listening to First Nations people. But it's my view and the view of the Labor Party that we can achieve constitutional recognition in line with the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
But does that mean you're wedded to having the voice enshrined as well in the Constitution?
Well, again, I would say that we need to listen to what our First Nations people are telling us. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart was a really honest and thoughtful and sincere request for the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be heard by all of Australia, not just the government. And to enshrine it in the Constitution is about providing long-term certainty for our First Nations people. And, you know, it is a bit legislative and it is a bit high level, but it is important to our First Nations people. And it's my view and it's the view of the Labor Party that we should be supporting them and bringing the country along with us. And Ken tried to do that. That was his initial intention, and Scott Morrison and the government took him down.
But you're saying it has to be in the Constitution or it falls short. Is that in short what you're saying?
I'm saying that that's what the First Nations people have asked for. We surely can be still aiming for that. Let's move forward. Let's listen to our First Nations people. Let's make sure that they're included in this process. But I don't see why we can't continue to push.
I guess the other thing is it's not an homogenous group. Obviously, they did come as a big, diverse group and come up with this option. But should you at least wait and see if they can be satisfied in a general sense by the latest shift from the government?
Look, I think that any step forward is important. Any step forward towards creating a voice is important. And we'll continue to be guided by our First Nations people. Pat Dodson and Linda Burney and Senator Melanderi McCarthy have done great work. I know they're working closely with Ken and we can continue to support Ken on this. But I still think that we can move towards constitutional recognition.
I want to talk GST, James Paterson. I know that you love getting stuck into talking about tax reform and so on. State governments pushing the wagon here a bit. Your colleague Dean Smith, where do you sit on the call to perhaps increase the rate, broaden the tax?
Dean is a colleague of mine that I greatly respect, and I think it's very healthy that backbenchers like he and I from time to time put new policy ideas out there to stimulate public discussion and debate. On this instance, though, I disagree with Dean for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's often misunderstood why the GST excludes things like health and education. It wasn't as a result of a political deal to get the GST through the Senate. That's true of fresh food, but not of health and education. It was actually a very deliberate policy design feature by Peter Costello, which recognised the fact that people who privately spend on health and education are doing so to alleviate, in part, a burden on the public purse when they could have free alternatives available to them. So it would be pretty unfair to penalise them with an additional tax when actually what they're doing is helping to alleviate the burden on public systems. But secondly, I think I'm not sure that the quiet Australians at this election voted to pay more for their private health insurance in the form of a 10% tax increase, or their school fees, or their childcare fees, and that's a practical implication of extending the GST to those kind of categories.
Right. You've looked into one particular aspect of that there, but is there any scope for broadening in other areas, for increasing overall? Because the idea here always is to simplify the tax system, get rid of other inefficient ones as well. Are you not supportive of that at all?
I'm a bit sceptical of the federal government doing the heavy lifting in order to provide more revenue for state governments who have failed to seize the opportunities offered to them and available to them to collect revenue to cover their own expenses in the past. I'll just cite one example of that, Tom, when Malcolm Turnbull and before him Malcolm Fraser both independently, separately floated the proposal of sharing income taxing powers from the state with the states. They ran as far away from that as possible on both occasions, 30 years apart. And the reason why they did so is most state governments, and this is not a partisan observation, I think it's shared by Liberal and Labor state governments, is they quite like the situation where the federal government has to go through the political pain of raising the revenue, and they get the joy of spending the revenue, and they get to complain whenever they fall short of what they would like to spend, blame that on Canberra. So I don't think raising even more money federally to give to the states and reducing state taxation would actually improve what is a fundamental mismatch in our federation.
All right, well, I sense we're going to get some bipartisan agreement here, Josh Burns, but can I ask you, I mean, the GST doesn't raise nearly as much money as it used to in terms of, well, more money in a raw sense, but nowhere near as much of the economy that it used to. You can review a tax count. The GST we got brought in 2000 isn't that way forever, and it can never be revisited.
I think there's two issues here. The first issue is that the GST is a ruthless, efficient tax that has no consideration of a person's ability to pay. It is a tax that where someone who is on a pension, someone who is on Newstart, a student, a single parent, is paying the same amount on a particular product as someone who earns a significant amount of money. This is not based on the progressive tax system that we have in Australia, which goes on the simple principle that if you earn more, you pay more tax. And the GST, while obviously it's a situation now where it's impractical to remove it, it shouldn't be increased. It would hurt vulnerable Australians the worst, and I wouldn't
Depending
want
on
to
the
see this.
compensation you gave out, of course.
Sure, but you know, what we did see was recently, led by the Labor Party and then adopted by the government, things taken off the GST, including sanitary items for women. I think that sort of approach is what we should be doing in regards to the GST, looking at ways and things that don't need to be on the GST to make sure that we are
there any others that should be taken off?
Look, I think that it's a range of things. I mean, making sure that we have, you know, food items and other things that don't, you know, that allow people who don't have a significant income to provide nutritious food for people. I think that's something to be looked at. But the other thing I would say is this.
What's the issue? Because it's not on fresh food there. What's the issue in particular there?
Well, look, again, Tom, I would say that the GST is a ruthless tax and we don't need to be looking at ways to increase it. I think the example of the sanitary items is a good one to say that there are things that are being GST right now.
But you were alluding to others.
More broadly, let me make this point, Tom. More broadly, I'd say that Unless we see leadership from the Treasurer and the Prime Minister on the economy, we're going to continue to see these sorts of ideas being floated by the backbench and by people like Dean Smith. We have the Reserve Bank, the IMF, former Prime Ministers, the Business Council, a range of leading economic figures coming out and saying the government needs to do more to address the economy. Increasing the GST is not going to do it. We need to be investing in infrastructure, bringing forward infrastructure investment in this country. That's the sort of economic reform we need, not sort of policy, floating ideas from Dean Smith and the like.
Just finally, Christmas Island is still being kept open, of course. Big cost, $20 million, the latest contract here on top of another one for hundreds of millions of dollars. Does it really need to be kept open, James Paterson? It was supposed to be open on July 1. Yes, that was contingent on Medivac, but the boats are not exactly coming across in a flotilla, are they?
Tom, I'm very proud of the fact that it was this government that closed Christmas Island, and we had no intention of reopening it at all, and we would much prefer not to have to do it. But when we did warn, when the Medivac bill passed with the support of Labor Party and the Greens, that it would require adjustments to our border protection regime because they were trying to dismantle it. And we know that it is an effective deterrent to people smugglers if you let them know that the people that they're going to try and get here to Australia are not in fact going to get to Australia but are going to be sent to Christmas Island instead. That's a powerful disincentive.
But can't you just say we'll open it again if they come? I mean,
journey.
It's open right now, and I know you hate government waste. There are 96 staff just at the centre on contingency, playing a lot of backgammon maybe.
I do, and I hope when the Medivac bill is presented to the Senate, probably when the Senate returns, that it is successfully repealed so that Christmas Island can again be closed as it should be, as we are proud to have done. But in the meantime, I think it would be irresponsible to close it without that law being addressed.
Josh Burns, Labor's saying close the centre. There you go. It's a pretty straight up deal. Support the repeal of Medivac.
Tom, with all respect to my friend James here, the Medivac bill is a very specific piece of legislation that only accounts for people who were on Manus and Nauru at the time at which the Medivac bill passes. It has no consequence and no effect on people who may be considering coming to this country. Peter Dutton knows this, Scott Morrison knows this, the Liberal Party knows this, and yet they are playing fear with this issue. It is not Australian. It is not an Australian value to have a 2-year-old girl and her 4-year-old sister locked up by themselves on Christmas Island and spending $47 million to lock up 2 vulnerable children. They don't need to be on Christmas Island. Their parents are members of the Biloela community in regional Queensland. They are welcomed back. They are wanted back in their community. This is politics at its worst. Christmas Island does not need to be open. These 2 girls do not need to be there. $47 million does not need to be spent to keep this family there. It's cruel, it's un-Australian, and they should be brought back here immediately.
We are out of time. Josh Burns, James Paterson, chat soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.